Okay, on a more serious note, something I want to illustrate here in painting in general is when somebody is a painter and are forced to bid jobs, and a lot of this has to do with clients asking for fixed rate bids, and that gives a client the opportunity to inspect and decide whether they're going to tell the painter the job is sufficiently done to pay or not sufficiently done to pay. One of the issues that comes up when somebody prepares a bid, whether it's me or anybody else, is whether or not there's a color change involved. And I don't care what somebody puts on a paint label, the people who make paint labels aren't the people who are going to be painting a particular wall. And when they say a color change is close or not close or something like that, then you got to realize they're not the people putting the paint on a material. So here we're dealing with a situation where the original color was this yellow tan color that you see on this door. And the person who's in charge of bidding on this situation had given a time estimate based on fresh coat of paint with a primer, but not a full color change. What happens when you do a full color change is that you have to it paint's very thin. So the old color does show through as a tinting difference after the paint dries. A lot of times it doesn't show when it's wet, and then as the paint dries, you can see sections of the old color, which means you have to let layers dry and then put additional layers on because it does show. I mean, it does show if there's a color change. And you have to lay the paint on thick enough that the old color isn't going to totally show through, even if you've used a primer. Now, using a primer, there's different purposes for that, and one that's very popular here in the Pacific Northwest is called Kill Z. I'm not sure if there's this stuff right here. It's a good primer that prevents mildew and seals in odors. And so in this situation, this place had been smoked in, and we needed to seal in the smoker smell. Now that stuff can be tinted to match the old paint. And so if we had that tan color, and I told the person, hey listen, let's take a paint chip off the old stuff and make sure you tint everything to match the old paint. And the person in charge of getting the paint apparently had made a different judgment call, which was based on the fact that if all the paint was the same color, that they might not be able to determine how thorough we were in painting. But if it was a different color, they could tell where we painted and where we didn't, which is true. On the other hand, when you create a color change as a means of supervising a job, you make it necessary for this paint to have to be recovered in order to have a clear consistency. So here, it's very difficult to tell in the video, but on the right is what's had 3 coats. On the right is what's had 2 coats, and what's on the left has had 3 coats. And you can see a difference there. It's not just a texture difference from one being wetter than the other. There is a little bit of a color difference. It's not that both aren't white, but one of them is more white than the other because it's taken more of a color change because it's got an additional layer of paint. So when somebody wants to judge a paint job on how thick it's or how thoroughly it's been, yes, we can cover the entire wall, but it's never going to be as consistent until we have sufficient layers of paint to change that color entirely, to the point where if I were to put additional layers of paint on, there would be no difference in color because it's thick enough that you're not seeing the old layer below that. When we're forced to use a different color of paint, it's not just a matter of, okay, you didn't do the corners or did do the corners. It's a question of making sure that a color difference no longer shows behind the new stuff. And so that's why these things end up taking a little bit longer than, let's say, was described in a bid. If the bid was described as very clearly, there would be no plan to color change. So on with this painting job, but I wanted to illustrate this in a video because I suspect it's going to become an issue when somebody wonders why this job took a day longer than planned.